Good morrow, fellow humans. I'm just making sure that everything is working, but here we are. This is our very first live stream. Sean here. Very, very happy to have you here. Very, very happy to be sharing my time with you. Very happy to be up late on a Sunday evening or Monday morning. I'm assuming it's Sunday morning or something close to that where you guys are. But very excited to be doing this for the first time. I am going to be looking around my screen as we go just to see if we've got people that are making comments in the chat section, and also reading some of the comments and conversations that we've had across the last couple of weeks. So here we are. Let's get into it. The idea of the infinite now is that we are trying to unpick the infinities of what is. We're playing with metaphysics. We're playing with just the idea of what reality is, what we are in respect of reality. And I named today's video, why is there something rather than nothing? It's an ancient question. It's a question that sits at the root of pretty much everything that we talk about here on the channel. And it's just beautifully simple. Why is there something rather than nothing? It's really hard to even begin to think about how you would start to unpick a question like that. I mean, it has so many vast absolutes in every single part of the sentence. Why? Well, we need to break down the sentence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, why itself is an extremely interesting word. Why is there something? That's another extremely interesting word. Why is there something rather than nothing? And nothing is by far one of the most intriguing concepts that humanity have dealt with across our entire exploration of what is. What is nothing? Now, let's pick that apart. So, the concept of nothing for many people is the concept of an absence of things. Now, if you were to take a materialist, physicalist view of the world as presented by modern physics, and we would take away all of the material interactions, all of the energetic interactions, all of the atoms, all of the subatomic particles, all of the quantum fields, take away the whole process, what would you be left with? Now, it's debatable as to whether you would be left with anything at all. I think that most physicists would say that you wouldn't be left with anything at all. But if you were to declare that that would be nothing, that you would be left with an absence of things, but potentially still space, it's just not a space there is no relativistic space, it's just this void. I would argue that's not nothing. That's emptiness. And emptiness is a very different thing to nothing. Nothing is something that we just can't even point at. We can't think about it. Every time we try and attach a word to the concept of nothing, we do it a disservice. Every time we try and get at the concept of nothing, we have to do so by attributing some sort of adjective. We have to verbalize it. And as soon as we've done that, that's not nothing anymore. Nothingness cannot be spoken. So if we look at the equation, the sentence, why is there something rather than nothing? That sentence in itself is suggesting that nothing is a potential option for the way that reality could be. Now, if you have reality, you don't have nothing, you have reality. So it doesn't really come into the equation when talking about reality. We know reality is here. Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, again, that why. Let's move on to why, because you could shorten the sentence already. You can do away with nothing knowing that we can't talk about it. You could say, why is there something? And essentially it's the same question. It's just getting rid of the unnecessary component of it. So why is there something? Let's look at why. We opened up our investigation with the idea of why. Why is something that is usually in counter to how. Science works in the terms of how. Why is it always points towards something that is external to us. Why did something happen? It's for a reason, for a purpose. If something exists in and of itself, for itself, then it doesn't have a why. It just is. If you say it has a why is it here? Why did this happen? You're referring to external forces. How did it get here is talking about more of a cause and effect, an unfolding through time. How did X lead to X, lead to X, to the thing in question? And that's different to the concept of why, because why is a bit more abstract, but it's still looking outwardly. Then we get to thing. Why is there something? And that's the main topic that I want to be discussing throughout this live stream. I'm not going to stick straight to any script or anything. If you guys want to derail the conversation and we end up talking about something else, by all means, please do so. If you are here with me, shout out in the comment section. Just drop me a little emoji, and I, appreciate that, just to know that we're all in this together. But yeah, why is there something? We need to decide what we mean by the word thing. And that is a question that is an ancient question also, as old as investigating nothing. What is a thing? Now, the ancient Greeks, you had the atomists, and the atomists would describe this fundamental substance of things, that there must be some tiniest, minute, lowest level of physical reality that must be there so that it can then give rise to everything else. Because we know that things are made of parts. We know that we can break things down into finer grains of data, of information, and we can do that, but there must be a limit, was their thinking. And that was a thought that was then taken up by many thinkers that followed. It was also disputed by others, but science, especially as it became what it was as natural philosophy, it slowly evolved an ownership of that same idea, that there must be some fundamental substance. The reason why science took up that vantage was primarily because when they began it as a class of education, a class of inquiry, they made the call to only discuss things that we can measure empirically. Let's just discuss these things. They bookended it. They did it intentionally. They never said that the material world is what is. They never said that. That wasn't the goal of science. What they did was that they said, let's just discuss the things that we can measure and see where that takes us. Now, because I've mentioned this several times in other chats, because this has been so successful, we end up with a situation where people now think that materialism is somehow an answer to the world, an answer to the question of what is. It's also an answer to the question, what is a thing? So I put up, over the last week or so, I put up a few questions, 3 series of questions, and we're going to go through them, and we're going to go through the responses that people have left. And if you want to participate, if you want to jump on and you want to have your own say, if you haven't already, those questions are still up there. They're on the post section of the Infinite Now page, of the YouTube page. Go in there, have a look at the last 3. There's part 1, part 2, part 3. And under each, there'll be a little questionnaire. You can choose a multiple choice question. And you can put in your 2 cents as to whether you think it's one or the other. But we've already got the stats as it was prior to the taping of this, prior to now. So the first question was, consider any object. We're talking about things. All right, I'm going to be looking off camera a little bit as I read this. But it was, consider any object. What's the total number of unique perspectives capable of perceiving this object? How many different ways can we view this object? Because we're trying to answer, what is a thing? How many different ways can we know things? we've got a thing. In this case, it is Carlo Rovelli's "There are places in the world where rules are less important than kindness." It's a great book, but it's a thing. How many different ways can this thing be known? Because when we're talking about a thing, we're talking about what is its identity. Now, we obviously have its identity relative to me. We have its identity, now it's relative to yourself as well, but relative to perspective. And whether there is an identity beyond that is what we're going to try and get at. But the question was, what's the total number of perspectives that are capable of perceiving it as an object? So we'll break down a few different answers, and we'll look at some of the comments here. Now, the options I gave was A, a few million; B, an astronomical yet still finite count. So there could be any number, massive number, but still finite. And C, an infinite count. Now, the first one was pretty much not even taken up by anyone, and I probably wouldn't expect it to be. But there were 3% of people that did think, yeah, a limited amount, which is fair enough. It really came down to, is it a finite amount or is it an infinite amount? The answer, as per a finite, was 28%. An infinite count was 69%. So overwhelmingly, you yourselves, the viewers, the beautiful people out there, you thought that it was infinite. Spoilers, I agree. But let's look at the logic behind that. Okay, so I want to read one of the some of the comments that were posted. One was by Eta Carinae. I think that's how you pronounce it. I do know that it's a nebula, or it's the name of supernova, something like that. But yes, Eta, I think that's how it's pronounced. Eta Carinae, who is a regular commenter on the Infinite Now channel. So hello to you. If you're with us, I'm sure you will be at one point. Thank you for all of your feedback. It's been really great playing with these ideas with you, but I'm going to read your voice for everyone here. Okay. What was said was, I mean, if you think about the question physically, I guess you could have a continuum of viewing angles on an object. So that would be infinite. That seems logical enough. Let's just take the many angles that you can attribute to this book. Obviously, there's a 360 degree and there's a 360 degree. There's a sphere's worth of 360 degree angles. And because we're dealing with abstract points, we're not dealing with finite measurements. We're going to be dealing with pi in every turn of the sphere. So automatically, we get an infinite count just in a spatial sense. So we're only talking about spatially, and we very quickly have an infinite count of views on what this is as an object. I won't put it away just yet, because it's not just the view from every angle, because you need to go inside it. Okay, there's the view from page 1. There's the view from page 219. We're still viewing the same object. It still has an identity from every single page. And more than that, it's not just a 360 degree view, because there's also a distance factor in play as well. You could be an ant crawling along the cover. An ant's going to have a very different view from myself, but we'll come back to that idea. I'll continue to read the comment that was there. The comment was, I imagine, though, you may not want to count things like viewing angles as separate perspectives. So perhaps you'd rather a perspective is to state that a perspective is something that can compress all these viewing angles, maybe say a predicate or a model, such that when you observe the extension of that predicate, that is, the set of all things that are true of that predicate, you recover that continuum of angles. So in short, all that means is that all of the different ways that we can view it, that's one way of looking at it. Rather than saying that's an infinity, that's just one. And I think that's a very important distinction to make, because very quickly, as has been shown, when I've said how many different perspectives can view an object, well, we need to, just like we were at the beginning, breaking down each word, they've all of a sudden gone, what do you mean perspective? How many perspectives? What's a perspective? We need to define a perspective. And that's where we are now. Now we're trying to backpedal and define a perspective. We can't define a perspective of an object until we define what a perspective is. So maybe that's one perspective rather than an infinite. Okay. I think that what we should do is we should take the idea that there is, I don't want to discount any perspective. So let's say there is an infinite count in a spatial sense. Take that as a given. Thank you. Put that to one side. Now let's just call it one and let's look at the problem a different way. How many different ways can we perceive this object? If that's one way, what's another way? They go on. I think to determine the cardinality of perspectives, then, we'd probably be interested in whether we can use this predicate to build another predicate of differing meaning. Take the case of the viewing angles. For each possible pair of viewing angles, we can find another viewing angle by looking at the middle of the two angles, or any point between them, really. Since we can get that process indefinitely and obtain new angles, the cardinality of viewing angles will be indefinite. Okay, so we're still talking about spatial angles at this point, but the point is that we can't access any. And there were a few other comments going there that were relative to the point that was just being made. One was from, I think it's Katie is how you would say it, K4IT3C. It's very clever, I guess. I think that's what it is. KTO. They just said, perspective is recessive. You can always take a new perspective that includes the old one. Okay, so that's a different way of doing it already. So we have the spatial perspective, but then we have the perspective of the perspective, or the perspective of the perspective of the perspective, and so on ad infinitum. So that's another infinity that we have. Okay, so we've had two different types of infinity. Now you could say that maybe that's still part of the first set, but I think that you could differentiate depending on, again, like the predicate logic that we sort of throw in there. Okay, so we've got these different ways of looking at things. The next one I wanted to sort of point out here, there was Blank Tester, who's another regular commenter. Hello to you. They said, at any given moment, there is some finite amount of consciousness going on, but I don't know if it can be counted as an integer. If so, it's not infinite, but it is unknown. So the point there that they've jumped on is that the idea of the perspective is something that's relative to a conscious observer. Now, how many different points of view can we have? You take the ant again. The ant is going to have a different perspective on the object itself, but not purely from a spatial in a spatial sense. They will have a different qualia of what the book is. They will see it as a massive plane, whereas we see it as something of an object that is of importance to us and entertainment. Now, this is probably leaning into a bit of a Heideggerian way of looking at things. There's just the way of having it as an object that's present at hand, is the way he would say it. But there's also just the idea of our experience of reading the actual book. Okay, so what is the object? Is the object just the physical thing, or is it the way that it makes us feel when we're reading it? Okay, so there is a direct connection between ourselves and the book that is a perspective or a point of view on the book. that is real. It is what the book is. It is an aspect of its identity. But that's a brand new way of looking at it. So is the conscious interpretation, which we know that there can be many. We've already pointed out the difference between ourselves and the ant. Is there a limit to that? Is that an astronomical number, or is that an infinite number? That's hard to say because we don't know what consciousness is, but let's see if we can try and catch it out somehow. So there would be my view on the book, that my way of reading it, that I've read it and I've enjoyed it and I've experienced a particular book. But it's known that everyone who reads a book will read it their own way. I'm sure there's a quote about that, one book is 1,000 different books depending on 1,000 different readers. The comment in the comment section was, at any given moment, there is some finite amount of consciousness going on. Now that's a very black and white comment. Is that true? It's, as they say, it's very hard to be counted as an integer. It's very hard to go, how much consciousness. You could attribute it to an individual and go, that's one. That's the obvious way to do it. If we say that there's potentially other life forms and consciousness on other planets, if the universe itself is infinite, perhaps there's infinite consciousness. Maybe, maybe not. There's a really cool quote, one of my favorite quotes from Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I actually opened it up because I thought we'd get to this point. I'll read it for you because it's just the best quote. He's talking about, sorry, it's all bright now because I've got the screen in front of me. I don't have Jamie to the side saying, bring it up. Talking about the size of the universe. How big is the universe? There's a great number of planets, great number of beings. It is everything. And he starts breaking down, or the guide starts breaking down some more important information about living in the universe. Area. The area of the universe is infinite. Imports. None. This is a byproduct of infinity. It is impossible to import things into something that has infinite volume because, by definition, there is no outside to import things from. Exports. None. For similar reasons as imports. Population. None. Although you might see people from time to time, they are most likely products of your imagination. Simple mathematics tells us that the population of the universe must be zero. Why? Well, given that the volume of the universe is infinite, there must be an infinite number of worlds. But not all of them are populated. Therefore, only a finite number are. Any finite divided by infinity is zero. Therefore, the average population of the universe is zero. And so the total population must be zero. Which is hilarious if you read it with a British accent. I don't know if it's as funny when I read it. But there's something to think about in it. Let's break it down and see if it's relevant to what we just said. So, what he's getting at there is, whether he knows it or not, there's Cantor's set theory. Cantor's set theory. So the idea that you can have different sized infinities within one another. So you have the universe. The universe is infinite. You have, therefore, an infinite number of planets, according to this model. The universe may be finite. So that's an unknown. But we have an infinite number of planets in this model. Not all of them have living consciousness on it. Therefore, according to Adams, the number of conscious beings must be finite, and any finite divided by an infinity is next to nothing. As good as. Is that necessarily true? No, because if it is infinity, then you can easily have an infinite number of planets, and you can have an infinite number of uninhabited worlds quite happily in a universe that is infinite. That's not a problem at all. It's the same as saying that you have an infinite number of numbers on the number line, you have an infinite number of odd numbers, and you have an infinite number of even numbers. There's no problem with that. There are no more or less odd or even numbers than there are the totality of numbers. That's the point of infinity. So to say, as Blank Tester said, at any given moment there is some finite amount of consciousness going on, but I don't know if it can be counted as an integer. Well, whether it can be counted as an integer is a good point to make. But to say at any given moment there is some finite amount of consciousness going on, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Let's say that there is, because we're trying to catch it out. We're trying to find out how many different ways we can look at an object, right? So let's say that it is a finite universe. There was a Big Bang. It has expanded rapidly, and the expansion has been happening over 14.8, isn't it? 14.8 billion years? 14, 17, one of those. I should know that. Billion years, and so therefore the expansion is only a finite expansion. Possibly. Okay? Consciousness itself, according to the modern investigation of it, only emerged as we know it, and I won't push that too heavily because I know that there's a lot of idealists in our community and they will push back on this comment. Rightly so, go for it, keep my feet to the fire. But they will, I distract myself there. The amount of consciousness that is possible in a universe, that you have the universe that is a certain amount of expansion over those so many billion years. It's a finite universe. Consciousness started at a certain point in history. I'm back. And therefore, if we take consciousness from that point, and let's quantify it by being every individual that has consciousness, whether that be something as simple as let's push it. Let's say cells. Anything that's alive, let's say. Okay, now that's debatable in itself, but let's be forgiving here. We'll say cells. So trees, anything that is alive, even by that standard, it's still only a finite amount in this model. And that might be what Blank Tester was referring to, saying that there's only some finite amount of consciousness. In that model, that's true. But how many different ways can this be looked at? It's not just how many ways has it been looked at, or could it have been looked at in the past. It's ongoing. How many different ways are potential to it that it can be looked at? Right? So that's going to include all future consciousness. Okay, so let's take this model of the universe. Future consciousness. We're talking about life existing on a countless number of planets, and the planets are going to continue to expand, and it's going to happen for billions and billions and billions of years until one day the fusion in the stars is going to start to peter out and the energy is going to dissipate and the stars are going to cool, and we'll have brown dwarfs and all the beautiful colors of the different stars are going to recede, and slowly, bit by bit, the universe will cool to a point where no living thing can exist anymore. That's called the heat death of the universe. Now there's good reason to believe that that is what will happen to our universe. However, the Big Bang didn't come out of nothing. So if we bookend the universe to the Big Bang, to the heat death of the universe, if we do that, then we've made some sort of finite bookmark in the same way that science, take it back to the start, science said we're only going to talk about empirically measurable things. We have declared what the bookmark is. So what that suggests is that because the Big Bang was the beginning of our universe, beginning of space and time, going by modern models of theoretical physics, what came before, there's great reason to also think that maybe it was another universe. Maybe there was an infinite count of universes. Maybe there is many universes existing at this very moment. So that bookending of this universe and the amount of ways that consciousness could manifest and look and know what this object is countless. Perhaps. Because we got to remember what we're looking at is the amount of different consciousnesses that are capable of knowing what this book is. I've got a comment here. Someone's chimed in on the chat. Nah, also water too. It has memory and can reflect it. What if it also is a conscious being? Okay, take that. Sure. I personally don't think water is consciousness, but I have heard the hypothesis. I've come across this before. Let's say it is. Great. There's another version of consciousness. We can say water. We can say, if we listen to the unfolding of the narrative in the chapters, we were saying that interaction itself is what becomes consciousness. And if physicality, as we know it, is interaction, then that blending of where consciousness starts and ends is very, very abstract. But if we try and keep things simple, because we're trying to get those predicates, we're trying to get the ways of looking at it. There was the spatial way of looking at it. There was we got into the idea of the recessive perspective. Okay, we've also now got the idea of conscious interpretation. There's every different way that could read this book, every different way that could, like the way this book exists to my dog, right? The way it exists to a plant, you could put it on a plant and the plant will wither and die perhaps. Okay, so the plant has a point of view of the object, because we're still, remember, that's what we're trying to identify. How many different ways can we interpret this object? An infinite number of infinite number of ways, possibly an infinite number of ways. It's the set upon the set upon the set upon the set. I'm just reading your comments here. Exactly. I think there's we've got a little bit of Buddhism popping up in the comments, which exactly, we've got this ebbing and flowing of what reality is. So the book, or the object, the amount of ways that we can perceive it, whether it is an infinite variety of ways that it can be known, and then within each of those different ways, you can have a further explicated infinite variety within that. I think that it's safe to say that we can tie this concept. What was the question at the start? What's the total number of unique perspectives capable of perceiving this object? 69% said an infinite count. And I think there's plenty of reason to say that that is a safe and respectable assumption. And I say assumption because we are finite beings. And when we're talking about infinities, we're only dabbling. It's the difference between knowing and imagining, because we can't know the idea, but we can imagine that we know the idea, which is a useful way of unpicking things. That's an idea we're actually going to get into next week's chapter when it comes out, so I won't go too much into that. But yeah, okay, so we have an infinite count of ways that this object can be perceived. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is something? Well, this is a something, and there are an infinite count of perspectives. What was question 2? I have to go back because it makes me do that. Question 2, as I said, for those of you who've jumped across onto the live stream who are with us now, if you would like to, you can put your 2 cents in on the multiple choice questions that are on our posts page. You'll see just the last 3 or 4 or however many it was, that there are multiple choice questions for each of these different points. The first one was how many unique perspectives. If you agree with us that it's infinite, jump in there, do the little click if you want to. If you already have, that's fine too. Question 2 of this unfolding idea of what is a thing. Consider the multitude of perspectives that uniquely appreciate an object's identity, right? So we're considering these infinite amount. Would the totality of these perspectives add up to a complete knowledge of what that object was? This is a different question. 18% said yes. If we had a summation of every single perspective that we just offered, the infinity of infinity perspectives, would that be a complete absolute knowledge of what the object was? Would we have a knowledge? Would we have the object? Because every view, like I have a view of it, you have a view of it. Do we have a totalistic view of it? Of course not. We've got a relativistic view of it. So can we attain, even through like a God's eye view, can we attain a totalistic view? 18% said yes. 64% said no. And 18%, same as yes, said, well, let me put it this way. And let's see how they put it. All right, and I've got some notes here. Are we having fun? Are we enjoying this? This is a live stream. This is great. You got your people here. Hi. It's happening real time. If you put up something in the comments section and it takes me a while to respond, you know, there is a bit of a 10-second delay between you guys chatting there and me getting it. But that's fine. Chuck stuff in there. Chat amongst yourselves, because, you know, it's good for vibes. All right, considering the multitude of perspectives that uniquely appreciate an object's identity, ask, would the totality of these perspectives add up to a complete knowledge of what that object was? 19% yes, 63 no, 19% let me put it this way. Now, there was 2 differing ways of understanding this. One was, again, Ita Carini versus Louis 22656, another one of our repeating faces. So let's read what they said. Louis, the object would be seen to be an interdependent phenomenon, inextricably linked to all other phenomena, rendering its existence as an object erroneous in the first place. All right, let me read that again. The object would be seen as an interdependent phenomenon inextricably linked to all other phenomena, rendering its existence as an object erroneous in the first place. Right, so it is an interdependent phenomenon. It is something that is dependent on everything else. It doesn't have a nature or an identity that is in and of itself. So there is only the subjective viewing of it. So there's my view of it, there's yours, and we continue to sort of pick that apart. And then to say that there's something else ultimate underneath is to suggest something more, because it is interdependently linked as a phenomenon to every other phenomenon. Everything that is gives rise to everything else. That is what is. That's the nature of what is. Now, the counter to that we had was it was a bit of a material understanding, and that's why I like it as a contrast. So did I write it down? All right. So the question again was, would the perspectives add up to a total, complete knowledge of what the object was? I think so. Quote, I'd take a pretty broad notion of perspective here, and I think that's fair enough, because you helped us stretch the idea of perspective in the last part. I just happen to think that so long as a model of something can be generated, there is a way of turning an infinite set of things, like perspectives, into a finite set of perspectives. And I think that's evidence, not proof, but evidence, that such a thing can be done for each possible perspective. There is that. But there is also the thermodynamic limit to information. Now, this is not too dissimilar to the conversation we just had a moment ago in terms of the heat death of the universe, the boundaries of how much information can actually be processed in one universe. And it depends on, if we're going to bound our conversation to just this one universe, if that's all there is, if we're believing that that is all there is, then we must do that. If we think that there's something more, it doesn't necessarily have to be a multiverse or anything like that. It could just be ebbing and flowing of universes. It could be this one, next one, and so on. So there's the thermodynamic limit to information. Now, if you don't think that's relevant, then you would believe that new perspectives don't generate any new information, meaning that the sum of all possible perspectives, information must be less than or equal to the information contained by the object. If there are an infinite perspectives, then either each perspective has some information, meaning the sum of possible perspectives will have infinite information, asymptotically decreasing in information, which would make compression possible. Sorry for the juttering there when I was reading that. It's a little late. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. I want to break it down. So the limit to information, objective. All right. So each perspective has some information, meaning the sum of possible perspectives will have infinite information. Asymptotically decreasing in information, okay, which would make compression possible. So it's about how we deal with our information, how we structure these ideas by taking this infinite set of things and calling it one, rather than calling it infinitely many. That's my dog barking in the background at 1 o'clock in the morning. If he continues, I'll go and check on him. So the idea is whether the perspective of the object, his name's Einstein. The poor guy is deaf and blind. He's 15, 16, 15. Beautiful dog. But I named him after the dog from Back to the Future. There you go. He stopped now. He barks at ghosts because he can't see anything. But, he'll get over it in a second. So, the thermodynamic limit to information, we're talking about the brain, how many different ways that it can be known, the brain as a physical entity, not just brain chemistry, but also just atomic energy. How many different ways can it be known? Now, another interesting part of this, of the object, is when do we stop talking about the object as being an object? Because obviously, when I'm looking at a picture of a galaxy, I'm looking at the same thing. If I could get a photo of the Milky Way galaxy, am I looking at the book? Now you might say no. But if I'm looking at the atoms that are contained within this under some sort of electron microscope, am I still looking at the book? Well, yeah. If I'm looking at the molecules, if I'm looking at the atoms, if I'm looking at the subatomic particles, where does that stop? Now, if we assume that there is a finite small a bottom layer to what the physical world is, which you could take the Planck length, because we're talking about thermodynamics and a limit of information. If we take the Planck length and we're talking about quantum mechanics, well, yes, there is a certain point where all of a sudden talking about things stops making sense. There is a certain scale, it's the uncertainty principle. It's a core element of quantum mechanics, and it basically says the more you know about some object's location, the less you know about its momentum, and vice versa. If you have an infinite or absolute understanding of its location, it doesn't have momentum. And that doesn't mean it's stationary, it's that its momentum is meaningless. And vice versa. If you can understand to an absolute sense, which is quite likely not possible, but if you were able to know how fast it was moving, its momentum, then its location would be meaningless. It wouldn't have a location. Now, the way you interpret that depends on how you interpret quantum mechanics, and that's well up for debate, so knock yourselves out in the conversation. Hi, Sai. Sorry you're late. I'm glad you're here too. What time does it start usually? I don't know. This is the first time we've ever done it. So if you're enjoying it, let me know. Please let me know and we will continue. So I don't want to get distracted. But yes, if you've got thoughts about what I'm saying, jump in the chat. That's why we're here. So, the uncertainty principle. Is there a smallest? Is there a point where we cannot talk about the book or the object any further? When we get past the uncertainty level, then we start talking about things like quantum foam and quantum uncertainty. But does the object itself stop? Like if we are within if we were able to take a photo at that scale, which obviously we can't because a photo is a light-based system and process. But if we were able to be there and Ant-Man it and look around, would we still be looking at the object? Is that a view on the object? And where does that end? Okay? There is nothing in modern physics that says it ends. There are theories in terms of quantum gravity, and quantum gravity models talk about quantizing of space and time. So there is a smallest element of space, but then you go, okay, well, here's a space and here's a space. And you've got all these many spaces next to each other, and their interactions are what give rise to time. That's kind of the model in a very basic way of describing it. But what's between them? Well, it's not space. It's quantum fluctuations. It's beyond our models. It's not nothing. Because we go back to the start, that nothingness is not something that anyone can talk about. If it's emptiness, then it's not emptiness, it's something else, right? But it's not emptiness because emptiness is space. So if you were to ask what's between it, they would say nothing. But by that they mean no thing. And these boundaries, like the beginning of the Big Bang, the singularity of the Big Bang, the heat death, the uncertainty principle, these seeming borders of material reality, they are meaningful to us, and they are meaningful to the way that we talk about reality. But it's important to understand that the infinities that pop up in those equations don't say that reality stops. It's not the end of space. Well, maybe it's the end of space, but it is more of a phase transition. I talk about this in the next chapter as well. But like how a cube of ice can turn into water, or water can turn into steam, that's a phase transition, right? The steam isn't the end of the water. The water isn't the end of the ice. It's just a different set of relationships and different activity of the same components. The atoms haven't changed. There's nothing in the steam that wasn't in the ice. It's just the behavior. It's the relationships, right? So in the same sense, you might have a point where quantum randomness, the certain relationships in that particular configuration become the quanta of space, or a subatomic particle, or an atom, or a molecule, or a book, or an object, or a planet, or a solar system, or a galaxy, or a galactic core, or whatever it is, a universe, a multiverse. You can continue to make these abstracted points, but when are we not talking about the object? We're always talking about the object. But if we're talking about the object relative to what we mean by object, then it's back to that first person perspective of it. So whilst you may look at the universe, look at a galaxy, Milky Way galaxy, and go, well, I'm not talking about the whole thing, I'm talking about the book. But then you could look at the atoms inside the book and go, well, these are the book. It's no different. It's the same thing that's all happening. And where we make the division between what is the book and what is not, that's an abstract concept. It doesn't make sense in modern physics to talk about an absolute object. It doesn't have an absolute identity in that sense. So when we're talking about the difference there, we had one comment was talking about the thermodynamics and the limit of information. The other one was talking about interdependent identity, that an identity is what the identity is because of what everything else says of it. Okay? So that's something to take note of, that the book is the book relative to those perspectives. So we've got a variance in mind. We've got the variance of recessive perspectives. We've also got a variance in time. That's one that we haven't looked at. So the variance in time, now all of us, we're looking at the object, right? There's us looking at it now, and there's us as we were looking at it when the live stream started, however long ago it was, nearly an hour. Good on you. Right? That's when it started, and we had a different view on it. Every time that a second passes, every time that a minute passes, we've got a different perspective on that same object. So just for you who are watching at the moment, if you haven't been following the entire time, we're considering with the multitude of perspectives that uniquely appreciate any object's identity, what is the totality? Would the totality, of these perspectives add up to a complete knowledge of what the object was? 64% said no. But it's not that black and white, because it's not that we can't necessarily reach it. It's that the object itself seems to have what we call identity rooted in the concept of perspective. The object exists relative to a particular perspective that can refer to it, that can understand it, that can know it, that can interact with it, that can be affected by it. But its absolute identity hinges on those perspectives. Now, this is something that was very important in Enlightenment thinking, as the skeptics like René Descartes came in and they're like, okay, so we have the res cogitans, the thinking. We have the res extensa, the material. They're separate. But for Descartes, the res extensa was something that was there. You had to be skeptical about it because I can only think, therefore I am. But we can talk about the res cogitans. Sorry, the res extensa, the object. But really, it came to a head when Kant started playing with these ideas. So with Kant, we had this distinction of the phenomenal and the noumenal world. Okay, so we have the noumenal world. Well, the phenomenal, firstly, is what we're talking about here. We're talking about phenomenological reality, where things exist in terms of them existing relative to us. Right? Now, Kant understood that to a degree, and he would talk about how everything that an object is in our mind is only in our mind, okay, down to the very core elements of space and time. Now, that he called those the pure forms of a priori intuitions. Essentially, it was the shape of understanding. Okay, space and time is how we think, not what's out there, not what we're interacting with. Space and time is the shape of our thoughts. And he had a few different reasons for that. One was that you can't imagine a reality without space or without time. You can think of time stopped. You can think of empty space, but just no space and no time. The mind doesn't do that. That's not how the mind, when it's processing ideas, it has to process them in a spatio-temporal way. And for that reason and a few others, Kant suggested that that's an aspect of thinking. The material world that's outside, it exists, and we will have objects that exist in and of themselves, but they exist in the noumenal world. Now, we can't know anything about that world at all. We can't interact with that world. Just reading your comments. We can't interact with the noumenal world. We interact through our senses. So there's a sensory interaction, but that's when we talk about our senses, it's not the body that we know, because the body that we know exists in space and time. So we have a view of ourselves, and there is a sensory something that's beyond the senses that's going out into the world. But what that world is, we don't know. So for Kant, the object still existed. There was still an object in and of itself somewhere out there. And that's how we can, in our sensory world, come to know it. It's just we translate it in our mind as space and time, as a spatio-temporal object. So let's move on just quickly. Okay. I'll make this other point before we do move on. So the idea of these things that exist in and of themselves, these objects, whatever they might be, even if they're unknowable, then they must have some substance, something that is its ultimate form. And this is what many thinkers had tried to understand. What is the ultimate substance? And many of them went, okay, the only thing that we can hang our hat on, the final thing that everything must be, is God. So you have this idea of God being the ultimate substance, and everything is a fragmentation or a manifestation of God. Aristotle had the prime mover. Plato had his ultimate form of goodness. And there were these pristine ultimate somethings that were the ultimate number one. They were what was. And then from there they get distorted and twisted by our minds, and then we get the fragmented version of it, which is things, which is objects, which is ourselves, which is sensory understanding. So in relation to our question, would a totality of these perspectives add up to a complete knowledge of what that object was? There's one more comment in here. I thought there was. Matt Angiono. Matt Angiono. Sorry, Matt, if I pronounce your name incorrectly. And he said the totality would add up to be the universe, or you, or God, all the same thing, which is the totality. That is assuming you're including the consciousness and experience of being of all such perspectives. So when you add up the totality of perspectives on the object, do you get the object? Or is the totality required the totality of reality? Is there any perspective that can anywhere in reality that is not in some sense a point of view on an object? You can attack that in any way you want. Spatio-temporally, you can attack it in a consciousness sense. I like to approach it from the idea of potential perspectives. Now, these are abstract ideas, but you could start to think about these in the sense that behind me is a view, right? We're seeing it in the camera. You're seeing it on your screens. There's a view behind me, but I'm not seeing it with my eyes. If I was to turn around, that'd be a different thing, but it's there. Or let's say there's a view of the back of my head. That's a better one, right? No one of us is seeing it, right? But the idea is that it's potentially there, that there's a potential point of view there. Now, in what sense is that there? Taking into consideration everything that we've said about the idea that all of the elements of the back of my head, its color, its texture, its spatio-temporal location, these are all things that are relative to a perceiver. So what's the perspective that's viewing that? Well, we could say that it's existing relative to us because we're able to talk about it. The fact that we can talk about it means that there's something that we're referring to. So that's a potential perspective. And I'm not saying it's an absolute thing that is there, but because we can talk about it, therefore it has an existence. It's not a what is not, because you can't talk about what is not. You can't talk about the nothingness, right? The fact that we're talking about it, it is what it is relative to us in the same sense that the object is what it is relative to us. So in that sense, there are an infinite count of these potential perspectives. As I said, you could think about that in terms of different consciousness. You could talk about it in a spatio-temporal or just a spatial sense. And that's what I'm doing, talking about it in a spatial sense, that there's a view here that no one is appreciating, but it's still there. In a sense, it's not, and I'm agreeing with anyone who says that, but that's not the whole picture. Just to say it's not there is not completing the picture. It's there relative to us, it's there relative to me, it's there relative to you, it's there relative to whatever the manifold of space and time is around me in and of itself, but everything is part of the picture. As Matt said, the totality would add up to be the universe or God. That's the thought. But here's the last question, the third, the top three. Again, if you have just jumped on, then I would like you to, if you're interested, jump over to our posts page. You don't need to close this page, but you go over to the post page and you see the questions that we're talking about. And you can put in your vote if you want to put in your vote. The third question is, considering the multitude of perspectives. It's the same question, Sean. No, that was the second question. All right, the third question. All right. You have to go back a couple of posts if you go there, but not many. You'll see it. Daily Ponder, part 1, 2, and 3. Daily Ponder, part 3 of 3, which is where we're up to now. If an object can be perceived an infinite count of unique ways, can it still be said to have an absolute identity? If an object can be perceived an infinite count of ways, an uncountably infinite amount of ways, and every single perspective is a relative truth, a relative finite component of what it is, because it's a yellow book. Is it an absolutely yellow book? No, because yellow is something that's relative to me, to my eyes, to my concept of what colour is. But is it a yellow book? Yes, it is, right? So the relative finite truth is a part of its identity. The question prior was, if we had all of those perspectives added up, would we have a totality? And the answer was pretty much no. But if we have an infinite count of ways that we can view it, does it have an absolute identity at all, whether we know it or not? Again, that's a different question. So let's unpack it. Let's see what you guys said. Sly Fox Dan 7. Oh, I'll give you the percentages. Right. The other ones were quite heavy one way or another. Right. The first one we got, consider any object. What's the total number of unique perspectives capable of viewing it? 70% said an infinite count. Considering the multitude of perspectives that uniquely appreciate an object's identity, ask, would the totality of these perspectives add up to a complete knowledge of what the object was? 64% said that no, it wouldn't. It's not so black and white here. So if you want to jump in and give your vote, voting closes soon. Daily Ponder. If an object can be perceived an infinite count of ways, can it still be said to have an absolute identity? 45% of people said yes. It was 43 when I wrote this down, so it's changed recently. 43. Let's go with what it is now. 32% said no, and 23% said, well, let me put it this way. So the majority was yes. It still has an identity. It still exists. It still has an identity, an absolute identity, not a relative identity, an absolute identity in and of itself. The object does exist as something in and of itself, regardless of how many different ways you can look at it. 45%. Now that's not, it is a majority, but it's close. You know, chuck a couple of swing states in there. Right, let's see what they said. All right, there was one I was about to read, wasn't there? How are you all going? You all good? Yes? Enjoying this? I'm having a great time. I hope you are. Chuck some emojis in the chats, folks. It's just a beautiful thing that we have this technology. It's 1 o'clock in the morning here. Tell me, what time is it over there? Where are you from? Where are you viewing today's chat from? I don't do live videos. I don't watch them, I mean. So I don't know how they work. But this is fun. All right, Sly Fox, Dan 7. Of course they have an identity. Just because other perspectives perceive it differently doesn't make it less or different of a thing. And that's a pretty black and white claim for yes. Just because there are these multitude of perspectives doesn't mean that what it is different than what it is. The perspectives make no odds. It's what it is. And because we can perceive it, that means there must be something there. And it has an absolute identity. Now that's, in the Kantian distinction, that is the object in and of itself. Okay, it has an identity. The book has an identity. Now I want to make sure we sort of lean on what we're claiming here, because we're saying that it has an absolute identity. And that's very different to a relative identity or a relative finite identity. If you are a fan of modern physics, you will have come across relativity, Einstein's relativity, and the idea of your motion through time. You have a frame of reference, a perspective, like what we're talking about. A frame of reference, and you are moving, and time is moving relative to yourself at the speed of time. Somebody goes past you, and they're moving a little bit faster. Now, you can measure your clock. You can say, oh, I'm moving this fast, and I'm going to go along with my buddy here, right? And I'm going to shoot a light beam to my buddy, and he's going to reflect it back at me with a mirror. It's going to boop, boop. Okay, cool. I can see that. I can see it, and I can see how long it took for it to leave me and how long it took to get back. And halfway, which is when it reflected, that must be the point where it hit him. So based on that, we'll synchronize our clocks. Okay, and we're synchronized. That's great. Someone else goes past, as I said, they're moving a bit faster. They see us do it, and we go, boom, boom. Now, from their perspective, they're moving across in front of us, and they see that what's happening is that the light beam that left me went, from their perspective, when it hit them, and then it came back, and it came back slower, because from their perspective, that distance has changed. Okay, so their relative appreciation of what happened was that we were skewed. Okay, and because we were skewed, it took longer to get there and then got back quicker. We were moving at these different speeds. So I sort of messed up the description there, but it's still correct technically. By that understanding, they would say that our clocks at that halfway point were not in sync, that my measurement was completely wrong. But it's correct in our frame of reference. It's only incorrect in their frame of reference. So is their frame of reference correct, or is my frame of reference correct? The point is that neither frame of reference has ultimate claim. There is no absolute motion through time. There is only a relative motion through time. We're sharing a reference frame. So because we're sharing a reference frame, we are moving through time at the same speed relative to us. The motion, the observer who is moving faster than us sees that that's not what's happening, that we are moving at different times, and both claims are true. So, according to modern physics, relativity, last 100 years, there is no absolute measurement of your speed through time. But what we're claiming here is that there is an absolute identity to an object. So we're happy to get rid of absolute motion through time, but we're holding on to the idea of an absolute object. Doesn't matter how many times we look at it, how many different ways we look at it. Where is the absolute identity? Where does the absolute component of it exist? Because, as I said, it's a yellow book, but it's only yellow relative to you and me. And it's going to be a different yellow to you because there's cameras involved, right? So you're getting a different color than I am. Plus, it's the lighting of the room. That's going to change the color again. My eyes are different to your eyes. The interpretation of what the book is as we're reading it, that's a different interpretation. My interpretation to your interpretation, there are an infinite count of different ways you can perceive this book. Which one's the right one? If the infinite count of perspectives do not add up to what the book is, what is the book? What is its identity beyond the perspective? Now, we were pretty gracious with the term perspective at the start. We weren't necessarily saying just consciousness, but if we were to say just consciousness now, say I left the room and left the book here, there's no consciousness appreciating that book. So what it is when I leave the room, is that what it is? That could be an argument. That the identity of the book exists when no one is paying any attention to it. What it is. But I said an absolute identity to the object, not an absolute identity to reality itself, but to the object in and of itself. Where is the absolute component of it? Where does it start and end? I'm going to go back to one of the key thoughts in one of our earlier episodes, which is that the book's made of molecules, right? What are molecules made out of? I use the water molecule because it's a simple one. It's made of 3 atoms. We've got 3 atoms that are behaving, arranged in a certain way, and their relationship to one another is what we call a molecule. But look at it. Hold it in your mind's eye. There's 3 atoms. Okay, you can see those, right? That's a water molecule. In your mind's eye, see 3 atoms. Where's the molecule? There isn't one. There's no thing that is molecule. Molecule is just a class of relationships. It's meaningful, it's real, it's like in the relative sense, when we're measuring a molecule, it is an aspect of what the molecule is relative to us and our measurement of it. Just like the aspect of the book is that it's yellow relative to us. But you take the appreciation of the molecule away, there's no substance there that's molecule. There's relationships. Can we call that molecule? It's interactions, how it affects its environment. I've just looked up and seen Andrew Edwards. Everything is relationships. All things we describe are simply relational in nature to core primitives in nature. All things we describe are simply relational in nature to core primitives in nature. This is what we're getting at. Everything is relationships. And if everything is relationships, that means that objects are relative truths. They're not illusions. They're relational. They exist as a relational entity. They exist relative to us. They exist relative to a series of perspectives that is an infinite count of perspectives. But we must take the idea of perspectives loosely and understand that if we're including abstract concepts or abstract perspectives, potential perspectives, temporal perspectives, variance in consciousness perspectives, variance in... If we take the infinite count of perspectives that we agreed earlier were there, and then consider the idea that the object has an identity only in respect of its relevance to these many perspectives, be they conscious or not, that's not important. Does it still have an identity once it has an infinite count? It's a reflection of everything else. But the everything else is a reflection of it. So in a sense, yeah, it does have an absolute identity. But not in and of itself. Its identity is not absolute in the sense that it's separate from everything else or that it is independent, but that it is a finite reflection of everything else. What are we saying in the comments? Signals and interference patterns. Yeah. That's the thing. We have these things. So what's a signal and interference pattern? Interference pattern's a good one, because that plays into quantum mechanics as well. But if we have the idea that these relationships, be they what they may be physical relationships, they may be conscious relationships, there's an infinite count of different relationships that we could describe here. But as those relationships, be what they are, interact with one another, they interfere. And when they interfere, new environments emerge, new happenings, new interactions. They happen. And that is the birth of a thing. What's important about that, if that is what the thing is to understand that there was no start point. There was no absolute moment when those two things crossed, because those two things themselves aren't things. Those two things are the interaction and interference pattern of an infinite count of other things. The only time that we can distinguish between these many different objects is when, like with science, when we intentionally bookend our observations and say, we're only going to talk about this. We're only going to talk about the electromagnetic spectrum. We're only going to talk about the visible light spectrum. We're only going to talk about the material universe. We're only going to talk about psychology. We're only going to talk about mind, mathematics, abstract ideas. When we add, this is David Bohm through and through. So you've got David Bohm. Has anyone read David Bohm? He's got this beautiful book, which we'll talk about as we go on, called Wholeness in the Implicate Order. And the very first part of the book talks about our language and the way we dissect reality. And we dissect reality because our language and our thoughts work in fragmented terms. And if you look at our language is centered on nouns. It's a noun-based language. We have the nouns. Nouns are things. We have things, and the things relate to other things. And he offers a way of describing reality in terms of verbs. Rather than verbs just being the tying together, the verbs are the things. They are the process. And he lifts them up out of the continuum and go, this is what's happening. The nouns are misdemeanors. They're distraction. That's where we live. That's our world, because we deal in the finite. I'm not dealing with all the atoms in the room. I'm not dealing with anything other than what is left after I have ignored an infinity. After I have ignored an infinity, I am left with the object. And for me, there is the object. For you, there is the object. And we can talk about that. You take away all of the consciousness that is appreciating this book as a book, it stops being a book. Does it stop being an object? Well, it's not just consciousness that's appreciating it. Any interaction is appreciating it. And we have to be loose with our terminology there by saying appreciate it. What else are we saying? So everything is just a reflection of everything. That is what I've said. Everything is just a reflection of everything. Yes, however, we've made a mistake by saying everything. So if we want to talk in terms of things, yes, everything is a reflection of everything else. It doesn't exist in and of itself. We abstract it from the environment, we ignore the background, we separate it, and we give it a name. We talk about it in terms of its noun characteristics. Richard Feynman, there's a really good short excerpt of him talking to an interviewer, and the interviewer is asking him about what is that feeling when you put two magnets together and they push against one another. And he goes, "What are you talking about?" "It's the feeling. That's what it is." He goes, "Yeah, but what's the feeling?" It's the magnetic force. It's the electromagnetic force, and it's repelling. That's what you're feeling." He's like, "Yeah, but what is it?" And he goes on to tell a story. He's like, "Well, when I try and put my hand through the chair, it doesn't go through it. We don't think that that's weird. But it's the exact same force. There's nothing different there. It's the exact same thing." We go, "Well, that's weird." Well, it is weird. But when we're trying to describe it, we have to describe it in terms of something to be able to understand it. Now, for a layman, he says that you could describe it in terms of, let's say, a lacquer bands, this force that's pulling the lacquer bands. And it's like, if he did that, he would be misleading you. Because if you went down it far enough, you'd be ending up using, you'd say, well, how does that force work? And you'd end up having to describe the same thing that was supposed to be a metaphor for in the first place. So the point is that every time that we want to describe a thing, we can go deeper. And so for a physics major, he would go deeper for them. And for an expert at the same caliber as himself, he would go deeper still. But they always have to stop somewhere. They always have to go, this is what we're talking about. This is the noun. This is the end of the abstraction. We can talk about the electromagnetic field as a thing in and of itself. But we can talk about it in such an abstract way that it doesn't have a thing like nature. But it still has an identity. And that's what all things are. Does its absolute identity exist simply in its being? Does its absolute identity exist simply in its being? You could superimpose the beingness with its existence. Does it exist? Its beingness is its existence, in the same sense that we could have an infinite count of views of what Sean is. You could talk about my molecules, you could talk about my atoms, you could talk about my influence in my life, you could talk about me physically, you could talk about all these different ways as to what I am. And there's your view of me, there's my wife's view of me, there's my dog's view of me. There are all these different views, and they add up to what I am. There's my view of me, but there's no absolute identity other than that interaction, other than the relationships of relationships that are relating to one another. I'm just a series of relationships. As a physical thing, I'm a series of relationships. As a phenomenological thing, I'm a series of relationships. And right now, this is another relationship. We can talk about this conversation, and we might do later. We might go away and go, oh, I had this great conversation, or I watched this thing online and it was really inspiring. We'll talk about it as a thing, but it's just a relationship, and it's no more or less a thing than the book is. And if you're a physicalist, you would disagree. You would say, no, the book has a physical reality. And it's like, at what point does the book stop being the book? The physical reality is its identity. Sorry, the physical reality is one of the many relationships. All right, I think I'm going to wrap up soon. I'm really appreciating everyone being here. I just want to answer a couple of questions. Let's just make sure that we don't miss anything on the conversation here. So it was, if an object can be perceived in infinite count of ways, can it still be said to have an absolute identity? You guys said, 48% of you said yes. I'm saying that it can have a relative finite truth. Everything has a relative finite truth. It's not false. It's not illusion. It is not something that is a part of the what is not. It is real in a finite relative sense. but it doesn't have an absolute identity. For it to have an absolute identity, we would be talking about the totality of everything. That is where it is. And in that sense, it doesn't. It doesn't have an identity anymore. It doesn't exist. And I want to be able to have both of those. Aware that there is a contradiction. There is a finite relative truth, and there is a lack of absolute truth. And in that sense, we can have an infinite stream of finite relative truth in terms of our science, in terms of our philosophy, even in terms of our theologies. We can unpick these ideas as infinite relative truths, but we are never getting absolute truths. And it's not because they're hidden behind our perspective, like Kant would say. The things in and of themselves, that's not what it is. It's that there is only one infinite absolute truth, and that is beyond words, that is beyond nouns, because it's not a thing. That's what infinity is. But I won't go too deep into that yet. For now, I'll let the mystics play with that idea. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been a lot of fun. Let me just make sure that I haven't missed any questions here. The tension. 0 equals 1 equals infinity. Yeah. Perhaps identity is in the observation of the beholder. That's definitely a finite relative truth. I'm in Texas, curious where you all are. I'm very curious as well. Please let me know. Where are you guys? Because it really helps for me to coordinate these days again. I'm in Melbourne, Victoria. And it is 1:30 in the morning. It's really great to have you guys here, have you chatting to each other, even if it's only just a small amount of us. There'll be others that watch our chats as we go on in the next few days, I would say. For those who are sharing links to the Infinite Now, as I have seen you do, that's very appreciated. It's very encouraging. I'm sure we didn't cover everything today, but why is there something rather than nothing? Well, what's something? There isn't things, and yet there are. And maybe the answer is that the something and the nothing are, in some sense, one and the same. Much love to you all. I'm going to leave you. Enjoy your Sunday. If you haven't said, if it's Mother's Day where you are, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers. Yes, much love. I will catch you all later. Thank you again. That's my first live stream. Thumbs up. It worked. It worked. All right. All right, let you go. Much love. Bye-bye. End.